It's a great honor and a privilege to be here. I should also say that I was once at a lecture by a professor of philosophy who promptly fell asleep 2 minutes after beginning. This, in military terms, is called a preemptive strike. I shall discuss some features of civil society and its foundations, with which Franklin and Jefferson in the United States were entirely familiar because they had discussed them in Scotland and France. And I shall argue that underlying causes of many present-day political and social problems were predicted at the same time, together with remedial solutions. Everyone acknowledged Cicero as the source of their ideas, although he, of course, had explicitly adopted Aristotle and Plato to the Roman context. To many people at the time, the problems seemed to have acquired unmanageable proportions even by the 1790s, and they're surely vastly worse today. But I believe that there remain strategies for stemming the tide of corrupt and megalomaniac politics. And the reason is that the human causes of our troubles are precisely the human failings identified millennia ago, and to which David Hume repeatedly drew attention from the 1750s onwards. The lust to attain or retain power feeds on self-deception. But let's not forget that megalomania is a universal disease, as common among artists as among politicians, bankers, or generals. In my view, the practical steps upon which we should be concentrating need to be grounded in recognition of important philosophical claims. In this sense, the way back is the way ahead. I'm going to suggest how we might proceed at the very foundations of society, beneath, before, prior to, reflection on the art of living that interests most people. How can we best explore, examine, familiarize ourselves with, and communicate our ideas about size, or magnitude, and scale, proportion? The art of living, as we learned from the ancients, consists in divining the proper proportion of things, from which proper governance follows. To follow my path, therefore, I shall outline the view that the cement of society is conversation. The universal ingredient of conversation is trust, and the cement of conversation is propriety. By examining the cement, we can identify the scale of the structures it bonds and supports, and whether there are some structures it does not well bond or support. As many of you will know, the chemistry of cement is still not well understood, even though it was first used by the Hittites in 5000 before the present. And as many of you probably also know, they didn't know how to hold up the roof in Sydney Opera House. And in the end, they used epoxy resin, otherwise known as araldite, which they got out of a tube. Cement would not do it. The scale of everything we do affects both the quality and their interconnections with everything else. It was asserted for well over a century in France that the proprieties of conversation are the very same as the proprieties of society, and to study one is to study the other. Clearly, many of our contemporaries repudiate what counted as society in the group that I shall discuss, finding it to be both socially and politically repugnant. But I want to argue that the arts of conversation, as I conceive them, can and should be cultivated independently of that irretrievable social context. and that societies which remain in ignorance of the arts of conversation lack both values and skills which help to secure their very existence. The notions of scale and propriety, which are important in our discussion, derive almost as much from the classical world of architecture as from moral philosophy and rhetoric. The learned Renaissance scholar and architect Leon Battista Alberti, responding to Cicero's near contemporary Vitruvius, emphasized that proportion and appearance could be assessed only by reference to the particularities of the diverse contexts in which a performance was perceived. And he counseled architects always to invest in the largest possible model of their intended structures before proceeding further, in order, of course, to alert clients to what might unfold, but of greater importance, to help the architects themselves what might be entirely unsuitable. The model was the hypothesis to be tested, and, as he acknowledged, the model could not do everything. The reason was, and of course still is, that what works at one scale will not necessarily work at another. And a small structure cannot retain all its apparent forms, balance, and relations when enlarged, and the other way around. We have all seen absurd miniature models of the Eiffel Tower. But Alberti's point underlines, the central fact that in most cases, scale is a condition of intelligibility. To stretch a concept, for example, beyond the expected parameters of use is to diminish the possibility of understanding and the capacity to act appropriately in the newly experienced context. Since we have invented the tools we work with, our ideas and practices, we must be alert to the scale at which they work best, and otherwise need refinement, modification, or abandonment. Questions about taxonomy and the boundaries of concepts properly unsettle us. What are the criteria of identity and difference for any of the central concepts in politics, economics, or the law, such as democracy, freedom, inflation, justice? How, when, and why do such questions arise? And who is best prepared to address them? For whom? And with what consequences? Our concepts, I repeat, are tools invented by us for particular tasks in particular contexts. And their history through different contexts records unexpected distortions. Meanings change with context, witness the term democracy. Furthermore, philosophers have endlessly warned against overlooking the ineradicably evaluative elements in many of our concepts, and the fact that almost any term can assume emotive force. In a police state, where laws often define a crowd as more than 3 people, the term crowd is highly emotive. Norms, or normative features, irradiate thought and action. The special normative notion of conversation which concerns me was at the core of formal education from the Italian Renaissance onwards. It was taken very seriously in France and from the 17th century onwards, but was also developed in importantly different ways in England and Scotland. The founding fathers in America and their immediate successors derive their own understanding of civil society explicitly from these sources. But to adapt their insights to our own context, we must challenge our own dogma and political arrangements. Let me briefly remind you of the elite group of aristocrats, among French women in particular, who organized and hosted their salon over an 80-year period from the later 1600s. From the outset, and alongside self-conscious literary exchanges between each other, they explicitly set out to displace the adversarial tradition of discourse, which had been inherited from antiquity, and more recently nurtured to great effect by the Jesuits, for whom combat and victory in argument was always the goal. The adherence, almost an obsession, within the salon with appropriate manners, a combination of Roman Republican civility, Renaissance courtesy, and French courtly tradition, nevertheless challenged, and not always unintentionally, the behavioral patterns of the emerging urban bourgeois public. And from the 1750s onwards, the salonière had to reflect upon a new phenomenon. Tocqueville later correctly identified it as a merger of individualism and material competition. The problem was that what seemed to work within small and self-consciously governed groups, such as the salon, mutual respect, propriety, loyalty, trust, failed to make any impact at all on the very much larger scale of society. Why was this? Membership of a salon was grounded in implicit notions of friendship and trust. Amicitia was Cicero's term. Notions inextricable from a group of moral values that needed to be explicitly spelled out and defended whenever hostile criticism was launched in terms of political subversion, social divisiveness, or elitism. The primary bond of society, which friendship both animated and was itself strengthened by, was sympathy, which was a quasi-medical term throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, as of course you know. This attracted men towards the ingredients of moral integrity, honestum, namely prudence, justice, fortitude, moderation, the last of which was central to the idea of decorum. What is proper is morally right, and what is morally right is proper. At that time, therefore, propriety and moderation can be understood as consistency, in their eyes, in doing the right thing at the right time. And the preferred all-encompassing French term for decorum and its constituents was mesure, measure. But none of this lifted straight from Cicero's De Officiis, De Amicitia, and De Senectute, and his writings on rhetoric. None of this was familiar to the impoverished, inflamed, and unrepresented crowds that increasingly thronged to urban centres in France or indeed in England. If the newly vocal public was educated at all in matters of morals, it was surely not by philosophers, but by means of religious indoctrination. And even among his elite followers, there was little discussion, before Shaftesbury or Adam Smith, of how Cicero's interlocking concepts worked or what mechanisms came into play. Nevertheless, Cicero had shown how carefully the appropriate understandings had to be inculcated, learned, practiced, and nurtured. They were not and are not a priori intuitions. For Cicero, as for Aristotle and Plato, the chief bond between men is provided by thought and speech, conversation. Moreover, trust in one's interlocutor to tell the truth constituted the essence of promise-keeping, which was itself the core of justice. In Cicero's view, the claims of society and the bonds of which unite it take precedence over any egocentric pursuit of speculative knowledge, which is why the basic duties depended on a kind of quasi-natural social instinct rather than on formal reasoning. By the end of the 1600s, a reflective elite in France and Britain had arrived at the ill-defined and many-level crossroads identified by Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. The crossroads of freedom and authority, society and the individual, thought and action. Moreover, they signaled allegiance to precisely the same route map for navigation, namely, awareness and adoption of a set of fundamental concepts essential to the very existence of civil society: conversation, sympathy, and trust, judgment, justice, and moderation, and taste. By these means alone could the integrity of an individual or a society be achieved. I make no apology for endorsing these concepts, and I ask whether they have been or can be honored or implemented, fostered or even understood whenever any institution or organization exceeds its own proper scale. As Aristotle and Cicero had insisted, to talk of proprieties is, of course, to make a value judgment. And it's essential to determine how value judgments are made, by whom, when, and why. This is because how a concept is understood and used by an individual, and thus what it means to them, is intimately tied to how, when, where, and from whom that individual learned to use the concept. And the indefinite variety of contexts in which an individual can become acquainted, familiar, or comfortable about using it lies behind the manifest range of misunderstandings that occur, and that often heated disputes about the authority, consequences, and very meaning of a concept. As Humpty Dumpty showed, words cannot mean what I alone say they mean. Not, that is, if anyone else is to grasp what I'm talking about, or indeed if I myself am to be capable of remembering what I meant. In 1741, Hume commended the French for having perfected the most useful and most agreeable of all the arts of society and conversation. So let me hasten to my proposed definition. Conversation is a sacred and improvisatory practice in which the duty to listen precedes the right to speak. Conversation is a sacred and improvisatory practice in which the duty to listen precedes the right to speak. Conversation is a practice because it requires a range of learnable skills which must be used or lost. A practice is behavior sufficiently structured as to warrant association with explanations and predictions. Because it's learnable, it's teachable. Because it's teachable, there can be standards of achievement. Because there are standards of achievement, it must be practiced. Conversation is sacred because it embodies and conveys the values of the community in which it operates. Hence, of course, the preferred normative vocabularies and allegiances. The duty to listen underlines the necessity of judging the context before being able to estimate what might be appropriate behavior. And it also emphasizes the central role of manners in conversation, in which courtesy towards and trust in others takes precedence over assertion of oneself. A point that was constantly emphasized by the French and indeed then in Britain. Accommodation rather than argument as such is the aim. The right to speak is earned, but is also circumscribed by the requirement of appropriateness. Instruction to children to wait your turn, don't interrupt or hog the conversation, look at the audience, Open your mouth. Do not mumble. Listen to what's being said. All such guidance, which we've all had and quickly forgot, dwells on such matters and also answers the mistaken objection that if listening precedes speaking, everyone must remain silent. That, of course, is absurd. What actually happens, and indeed must happen, is that learning the arts of conversation takes place in contexts of already existing and complex human social practices, and those most certainly are not silent. Nevertheless, we have to be sensitive to the knowledge, attention span, and interest of the listener, not to become boring, insistent, intrusive, upsetting, offensive. All matters central to Adam Smith's famous point in 1759 about learning to see ourselves as others see us, a phrase borrowed by the Scots poet Robert Burns. The analogy between the improvisatory character, my last point about conversation there, the analogy between the improvisatory character of both conversation and music was commonplace by the early 1700s, because the emphasis was upon close attention to context and constant adaptation to a changing context, without which there can be no appropriateness. The greatest professional musicians of the 18th century were admired for their extraordinary skill at improvisation. Bach, Handel, Mozart, just to mention. And even at the popular level, no Scottish fiddler, for example, at a dance, or a folk singer, ever stuck to the minimal scores available. Similarly, properly educated and engaged conversationalists improvised throughout their performance, which would be centrally colored by their breathing, posture, faithful facial expression, as well as by vocabulary, pace, gesture, tone, rhythm, pitch, and volume. And all of these were explicitly discussed. Awareness of response to the body language of others was also underlined. The premise of all these writings, and there are hundreds, and discussions and debates, the premise was that one's duty was to perform appropriately in the theatre of social life. And it embodied the insight that success depended as much on sensitivity to the context as on rational reflection about the content of thought. And that insight itself revealed that most of the salon, the French salon, espoused a view more prominently canvassed in Scotland, as it happens, than by French philosophers. Namely, that human beings primarily are motivated by and respond to the feelings rather than to reasoning alone. We are emotional beings as well as thinkers, they insisted, and judgments of propriety are normative and are as much aesthetic judgments as verdicts about thought. Conversation cannot take place among a large group of people. The family provides the natural scale. And without special measures, most cultures since antiquity have found that groups, say, of 20 are too large. Renaissance writers thought that 9 was the maximum number for a conversation. The central reason for advocating the family scale is that everyone in a conversation is a participant, whether or not they actually speak on a given occasion. And all place trust in each other about how to behave. In a proper conversation, indeed, silences are essential and have different characters. A threatening silence is very different from a respectful or an excited one. As Rochefoucauld pointed out very forcefully in the 1660s. There was a lot of discussion about qualities of silence. A social reason is that conversations are most often practiced when sharing the very essentials of life, food. Children learn and absorb much from family meals. Formal dining is especially important at certain stages of society. In French salons, for over a century, it called for self-conscious preparation by host and guest, and bequeathed a legacy which has properly enriched Western culture ever since. Who might appropriately sit with whom? What topics might be appropriate for conversation? With whom? When? Why some issues might best be avoided or diverted? The very concerns all of us surely have tried to convey to our children and grandchildren. Moreover, only within small groups can the disastrous linguistic insecurity and incompetence which are so widespread in the Western world today and so quickly generate morose social antagonisms be effectively addressed. We all benefit from contributing to a conversation in addition to what we can get out of it. Less formally than in the salon, there was deemed to be inestimable value in congenial conversation in cafes and bars. In London, from the 1680s, coffee shops and taverns became the centre for new forms of social gatherings, with lively gossip, discussion, and exchange of news among a section of the literate and merchant classes. But the proportion of London's population that could afford to enjoy such pleasures was minute, and the practices of London, although widely publicised, were never fully replicated elsewhere. The goal of many of the private, we would call them discussion clubs, which gradually were formed, firstly in France and then a bit later on in Scotland and elsewhere in Europe. The primary goal of all these clubs was explicitly knowledge for the benefit of society. And this point needs a measure of emphasis. Conversation enlarges our awareness in all dimensions: aesthetic, moral, emotional, and all other forms of knowledge. Since encounter with and mediation by the claims of others assist in the detection of error and emendation of earlier opinion. The banner of improvement, under which many clubs gathered in the inns and taverns, which were the only meeting places, signaled that they would discuss matters, any matters, which even indirectly might improve the health and wealth of the nation. Most of these clubs were dedicated to special interests of their members. The three central topics in Edinburgh in the 1750s, for example, were agriculture, mining, and banking. But the range of topics was sometimes very extensive. One other feature of these clubs is worthy of mention, in addition to the fact that they explicitly limited membership and made attendance compulsory during the season, which was essentially from October to April. Every club found it necessary to draw up strict rules of behavior. And this wasn't only because of the liquid consumption that usually fueled the gathering. It was because conversation presupposes manners, the notion that Tocqueville identified as les mœurs, and formal acknowledgement of the required manners accelerated pursuit of the overall goal. Of course, what counts as good manners is always culturally and contextually anchored, because propriety is their criterion. And manners are contrived to meet perceived needs and goals, but they must be learned and practiced, and they rarely evolve at the same rate as other social changes, which is why they're often described as old-fashioned. But properly understood, manners have nothing to do with snobbery, class, or social exclusion. Nevertheless, If improvisation functions as a criterion of conversation, it operates even more obviously in the domain of manners, however slowly. Let me revert briefly to the notion of combat, cherished by the Jesuits but inherited from the Aristotelian view, that inquiry should be directed at the truth, and that from a debate focused on such ends, a winner must emerge. More sharply, those who were attracted to legal procedures held that winning is what matters, whether or not the winner arrives at the truth. The consequences of such notions bedevil present-day practice, underpinned as it is by an obsession with the alleged goal of all commercial market activities that only winning counts. Politicians and journalists oscillate between argument and debate, but very rarely engage in conversation with anyone. And some Western scholars have become interested recently in a Japanese tradition which seeks to avoid loss of face on the one hand and to achieve consensus rather than submission to a declared victor. It's called the both and approach. It is courteously assumed that every speaker intends or attempts to offer some insight to the discussion, to contribute. And that in any complex matter, it would be wise to accommodate the resulting diversity of understanding. So, yes, you're right. And there's also this to consider from this other viewpoint. I'm told that some communities in Africa, presided over by chiefs and elders, practice not dissimilar traditions. But, you will say, I don't see why conversation is a cement. The answer is that the ultimate moral duty is to think. Firstly, every participant in a conversation has to pay attention. Attention entails engaging one's mind. The expectation and possibility of conversation within a group and the acquired skills to conduct it enable participants to explore, refine, express, and finally act, when appropriate, upon coherent or justifiable thoughts, all normatively colored features. Only by expressing their thoughts can human beings come to know what they really are and indeed achieve self-knowledge. Expression is a necessary condition of thought, which is itself a condition of freedom of action. Encouraging people to think is the first duty of education, but many factors can atrophy that capacity. And when they do, society becomes dysfunctional. Thinking requires practice. Sustained thinking is tiring. But choosing not to think is the ultimate immoral act. Beware all those who aim to relieve us of the need to think. Leadership in the realms of value and tradition must start in the home and in educational establishments, but we have a dismal record over recent decades. If we are committed to upholding a civil society, which we understand and can explain, we must at the same time commit ourselves to the appropriate scales of practice. These scales may refer to the number of participants, the size of institutions, the time periods necessary for implementation, the kinds of training necessary for effective participation. All of this is involved in costing our values. We need to know the resources necessary for upholding and the sacrifices necessary for implementing. None of this involves rejection of economic matters, repudiation of urban life, refusal to adopt the benefits of technologies. It's nothing to do with burying our heads in the sand or sentimentally lamenting the days of yore. It is to place human beings in all their complexity at the core of discussion and the center of any social proposals. Not money, not material goods, not political power, and not abstract ideas. impatient politicians and truculent journalists are quick to deride all who insist on cautious reflection prior to the making of complex decisions, consequences of which are invariably unpredictable. And because the notion of careful reflection embraces the psychologically uncomfortable elements of relentless self-criticism and possible error, uncertain human beings are often persuaded to relinquish such tasks in favor of their leaders, who, of course, are eager to portray anyone else's critical analysis as disloyal, paralyzing, counterproductive, demoralizing, or a sign of weakness. But only when the disciplines of learning and self-criticism are inculcated, acquired, and practiced throughout the earlier years of life can human beings gain the skills and wisdom to contribute positively to civil society and provide some stability through changing contexts. When those disciplines are not encountered within the family, nor within demoralized educational establishments, nor in the small communities which are the roots of civil society, the likelihood of their otherwise emerging of their own accord is negligible. And we then confront the lustful, intimidating, shameless, and hypocritical anonymity of centralizing bureaucracy, government, and global commerce. To record an end to a conversation is to signal that life has ebbed from an endeavor or its participants. That is my end.
Now we can have up to 30 minutes for a polite, well-measured, relevant, appropriate contributions to our conversation. This is the basis of the civil society and your moral obligation. So if you don't contribute, I will make my moral.
And you have to contribute to the conversation, not just get something out of it.
Don't just listen. Listen is polite, but you also have to speak.
But
Yes, you have to.
Yes.
But
yes, think first.
here are too many of us.
Professor Jones, I have a question. Because you said that scale, how it's a polite question, but you said that scale is important. Taking into account that modern societies are all ever-growing entities, and taking into account that due to technological development, our communication is less and less direct, and we have even faced a new phenomenon so-called dislocalized societies. People are in different places and then they communicate using internet or any other modern technologies. Would it be a correct conclusion then that modern societies cannot be civil societies?
I think that's a very important question, and obviously I don't know the answer. But my fear is that if what I have said, and of course people I've stolen the ideas from, said about what we would regard, and they regarded, as the limited scale at which conversation can work to the benefit of all the participants, then modern society, particularly in its urban forms, its massive urban forms, and on the global scale, can't engage in that range of activities and mutual understanding. And as you rightly ask, the question then is, can there be, for modern analogues, using the amazing technologies that already exist, recognizing that individuals are not going to be face-to-face, even if it's visual through here. There are many aspects of their audio and visual encounters which will lack many of the we would perhaps describe subtle, almost theatrical features which we learn in the context of a family. Now, there will be people who will say, well, we must just be realistic. We're not in the 18th century, we're not in the Renaissance, we're not in ancient Rome. And maybe conversation then was of a standard and a breadth and depth which we now cannot achieve. There is a partial analogy to that. When I mentioned improvisation, I'm sure you all know this, but there was almost no printed music until the 1780s, and I mentioned all the great composers improvised. I am a clavichord player, among other things, and I happen to have a modern version, obviously, of Carl Philipp Emanuel's clavichord of 1746. And you'll probably know that Bach, that son of Bach, got arthritis in his hands, and he decided, he was judged by those competent to judge as the greatest clavichord player anyone had ever heard. He got arthritis, he decided he must stop. He chose the day to stop, and he gave the clavichord to a friend. He didn't know the friend very well, but with the clavichord he wrote a farewell piece of music called the Abschied, and it has no bar lines. It is about 5 pages of unstructured, in our eyes, unstructured notes, including what must have been very, very fast 64s and long notes. We've no idea how he played it. And I have never met anybody who knows how to play it. Those of us who struggle with it come up with terrible things. But it's a fascinating echo, if you like, farewell echo, of how things must have been done in such a self-consciously improvisatory context. Everybody had a repertoire of skills, resources, memory resources, of course, in how to do these things. We don't have them. We can't do that. Now, it's a partial analog with skills that we've lost. And, of course, there are many, many other skills we've lost.
Okay, so why, I mean, there is something probably more basic than conversation.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about conversation. Why don't mention a more general concept like discursive practice? You know, societies, you know, depend on this discursive core, right? You know, this idea of, for example, like Jürgen Habermas, right? Says, you know, societies exist because there is this glue, which is cooperation, and cooperation depends on this linguistic discursive practice. So conversation is just, you know, a temporal product in the sense that it is located in a certain time, a certain culture, or a more general idea, which is this one, right? The fact that societies need, you know, communication, you know, sometimes linguistic practice.
Well, clearly, it is one among many practices, social practices, which we all encounter and can benefit from. I wanted to emphasize something which, in my view at least, is best learned at the earliest stages of our linguistic competencies, which is normally childhood, of course. And by implication, I hope was obvious, is a set of skills which among our fellow adults now is less valued and implemented than might be to our benefit. I have challenged in the past groups of people by saying, I will lay a wager that none of you has witnessed a conversation in the last 48 hours. And they'll say, oh yes, I listened to the radio, I listened to the television. Well, what was the conversation? And it turned out, of course, it wasn't. It was an exchange of abuse or a reading of lists or something like this. And of course, my definition was a normative one, a prescriptive one, in fact. And I was trying to, so to say, challenge some of our deeply entrenched social practices of the present day, to reflect again on what the merits and benefits of those early learnt skills were, and ask whether have we got adequate substitutes? Were the benefits that we've lost? Not unlike the question before.
Thank you for the fascinating talk that you made. Yeah, my question was similar to it. I mean, why conversation? I'm sure that you taught alternatives. So I was curious, do you have a ranking of practices that could come immediately after conversation? I mean, conversation, you say, is the cement of society. I'm sure you talked about alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
Are there alternatives that could compete with conversation as something that put the things together for society? I understand the reason why conversation, but I was curious if you thought about alternatives to conversation.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a very unusual claim, I think, originally by by Cicero to start with, and then by the French, as to why they thought an analysis of their understanding of conversation was an analysis of their understanding of society. One might almost say that by definition they were going to end up with a very small society. It doesn't matter which one they start with, the conversation or society. I wasn't claiming that conversation is the only ingredient of society. Of course not, absolutely. That would be ridiculous. It is a human practice, one among many human practices, a lot more complex in its dimensions than we are typically self-consciously aware of, although children are aware of them. As children learn, we've had so many excellent examples, as they become aware of body language, imitation. We can't imitate unless you've noticed something. So the children are aware of body languages, smiles we've had. I didn't go into that, but I fully agree and admit conversation isn't the only element, but I do still believe that it is a cement as a crucial means of mutual understanding, the conveying of information from one to another, essentially.
I actually would like to ask a question finally, but maybe I'll ask it last. So, I have a question which I'll give you a little bit of context, and it's about emotions and conversation. And so I teach a course on emotion, and I start with Aristotle and his idea that emotions should be proper, and measured. So you should not be angerless, but you should not be a person filled with rage.
Yeah.
So he has this table where he finds this there's a golden point for each emotion,
Yes, certainly. Absolutely. Go on.
I just want to ask the question, because I want to turn it on its head a little bit. And there's lots of prescriptions for how to behave emotionally. And when I teach this course in the US, students like this idea and they think this is good. But when I teach this in Poland, exactly the same idea, my Polish student says that this just is a prescription for emotional inauthenticity. That is not only that it robs the society or us from knowing who people are. Because if every conversation is well mannered, let's say I hate your ideas, and if I always say, well, I believe that there might be some potential flaw, then you're not really learning about my proper emotional response. So how do we find a balance between kind of teaching the art of expressing emotions and being proper versus this really important value, humanistic value of emotional authenticity?
Yes. I am told by my Japanese friends and my African friends that in fact this is a problem. How to so to say resolve perhaps quite acute differences in a conversation simultaneously with trying to get at the truth. And some of the one particular area I learned about this was in connection with Rwanda. Rwanda, when they had gatherings to talk through the murders. That must have been absolutely incredible. And the way they did it, the tribal leaders were held weekly meetings, and people gathered and listened, and there was a cumulative emotional change. I didn't witness it myself, but I think you're quite right. There's a gap between, let's call it, the Eastern sympathetic approach and the head-on exclusivity that in Western binary reasoning, at least, we've inherited. It's an interesting point here, what I'm sure you all know. In the 1780s, there was a group of doctors in France. Some of them were vitalists, but they rejected the binary system of true or false for dynamic systems. There were two reasons for this they gave. One was, it seemed to them, in life systems, there was multiple causation, the separate elements of which they couldn't identify, but they were confident that it wasn't straightforward, simple, a kind of atomic sequence. And the other was that, in addition to multiple causation, the varieties and unpredictabilities of change in dynamic systems seem to render statements of true or false as not terribly helpful and possibly even obstructing. And it was in that context that some of the geniuses of the time, amongst whom I would certainly nominate d'Alembert, really took hold of the idea, which was, of course, already existed, that all our concepts are obsolescent. Not obsolete, obsolescent, because they're tools. All tools are devised for a given purpose at a given time. By definition, if the time has changed, they may no longer be appropriate, but it's inconvenient to change everything all the time, and we're very likely to be suffering from obstructions by using concepts that are not actually doing much work or preventing us from using better tools. And I find that an amazing insight for 1750. I'm not implying that everyone was an idiot in 1750. I just think this is a marvelous idea. Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Did you catch that?
Yeah, so basically, how do you account for other forms of conversation like gossiping or verbal conversation?
Oh, yes. As I said, my definition is a normative and a prescriptive one, and it's obviously a subset of interactions between human beings who are talking. And I, as it were, artificially focused on this particular element. Of course there are discussions and gossip, absolutely, yes. But it's quite interesting, isn't it, that if we reflect, we do have expressions in our vocabulary which indicate our awareness of this. We might say, oh, I enjoyed that chat, we must have a conversation about that. Or we say, I really enjoyed that conversation, let's go on with it. And my remark at the end, where I said, if a conversation ends, either the people are dead or somehow everything has collapsed, was meant to indicate that conversations are not constructed with an intended goal or end. They're not trying to reach a goal. That isn't to say they're not trying to improve understanding, enlarge awareness, and all the rest of it, but a terminal point is not envisaged in a conversation. But I think our understanding of conversation as different from gossip, chat, passing the time of day, or even argument, we become aware of this pretty soon. We tell our children, don't we, or we were told ourselves, stop arguing.
Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you very much.